I want to begin by thanking the organizers, John Pierre and Philippe Roussin, for putting together such an excellent conference. In what follows, I'll be making a case for not just the desirability of making narratology more diversified, but also the necessity to do so. But before the analyses, a definition and a story. There's still a little bit of confusion concerning unnatural narratives. Here is my definition. Paradigmatic unnatural narratives are those that violate mimetic expectations, the canons of realism, and the conventions of conversational natural narrative. They present events and entities that contravene the practice of non-fictional narratives, usually in a flagrant manner. That is, they are not merely non-realist, but anti-realist. And here's an example of an unnatural text by Mark Lehner. He's got a bomb inside. He puts the keys in the ignition and turns it. The car blows up. He gets out. He opens the hood and makes a cursory inspection. He closes the hood and gets back in. He turns the key in the ignition. The car blows up. He gets out, slams the door shut disgustedly. He kicks the tire. He takes off his jacket and shimmies under the chassis. He pokes around. He slides back out and wipes the grease off his shirt. He puts his jacket back on. He gets in. He turns the key in the ignition. The car blows up, sending the debris into the air and shattering windows for blocks. He gets out and says, "Damn it." He calls a tow truck. He gives them his AAA membership account number. They tow the car to an Exxon station. The mechanic gets in and turns the key in the ignition. The car explodes, demolishing the gas pumps, the red and blue Exxon logo high atop its pole, bursting like a balloon on a string. The mechanic gets out. "You got a car bomb," he says. The man rolls his eyes. "I know that." Okay. So what is missing from conventional accounts of story? That is, fabula and sujet, beginnings and endings, and the notion of narrative itself. Fabula. Mayer Sternberg has indicated the importance of the distinction between fabula and sujet, histoire and récit, for narrative theory, asserting, quote, "Actional discourse, whether literary or historical or cinematic, presupposes temporal extension, which provides a natural principle of coherence, one that enables the narrator to construct his presentational sequence according to the logic of progression inherent in the line or chain of events themselves, from earlier to later and from cause to effect." As his metaphors of line and chain indicate, Sternberg here reveals himself to be trapped by mimetic presuppositions. As Monika Fludernick has pointed out, the story versus discourse opposition seems to repose on a realist understanding of narrative. A consistent fabula can indeed be derived from every non-fictional or conversational natural narrative, as well as mimetic or realistic works of fiction that strive to resemble those discourse types. There remain, however, a number of varieties of unnatural fabulas that elude the mimetic model, which narrative theory needs to account for. A narrative can circle back on itself, as the last sentence becomes the first sentence, and thus continue perhaps for eternity, as Joyce's Finnegan's Wake or Nabokov's The Circle. Such a fabula is infinite. In other works, time passes at different speeds for different groups of people. Thus, in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, 4 days pass for the nobles in the orderly city, while, at the same time, 2 days pass in the enchanted forest. In Carol Churchill's play Cloud 9, 25 years pass for the characters, while a full century passes for the rest of the world. These cases result in dual or multiple fabulas. Other texts have contradictory sequences of events, such as Robbe-Grier's La Jalousie and Robert Coover's The Babysitter. The different incompatible endings, all present all present in Coover's text include the following. The babysitter accidentally drowns the baby. The husband who hires her comes back early to have sex with her. The babysitter is raped and murdered by neighborhood boys. The family returns to find all is well. And the mother learns that the children are murdered, her husband is gone, a corpse is in the bathtub, and her house is destroyed. Ursula Hesse has observed that such novels, quote, project into the narrative present and past an experience of time which normally is only available for the future, time dividing and subdividing, bifurcating and branching off continuously into multiple possibilities and alternatives. Instead of one event precluding several other possible options, all possibilities can be seen to have been actualized. In none of these examples noted in this section can one easily extract a single consistent fabula from a fixed sujet, the way one might in any natural or realistic narrative. Alain Robbe-Grillet, referring to the contradictory fabula in Jealousy, stated, "It was absurd to propose that in the novel there existed a clear and unambiguous order of events, one which was not that of the sentences of the book, as if I had diverted myself by mixing up a pre-established calendar the way one shuffles a deck of cards." He went on to state that for him, there existed no possible order outside of that found within the pages themselves. Building on the work of Emma Kaffelenos, we may say that works like these have an indeterminate contradictory fabula and a fixed sujet. Two other experimental techniques employ features of the discourse to create or destroy the fabula. These two are textual generators and denarration. Both appear prominently at the beginning of Robbe-Grillet's In the Labyrinth. First, we learn that outside it is raining. The wind blows between the bare black branches. In the next sentence, this setting is denarrated as we are informed instead that outside the sun is shining. There is no tree, no bush to cast a shadow. Inside the room, there's fine dust that coats every surface. This dust, in turn, generates what will become the definitive weather beyond the walls of the house. Outside, it is snowing. Similarly, other surface images on the inside generate objects in the story world. The impression of a letter opener becomes a soldier's bayonet. A rectangular impression produces the mysterious box which the soldier carries. A desk lamp gives rise to a street lamp outside in the snow, which in turn yields a soldier leaning against it, holding a box. And a realistic painting, The Defeated Reichenfels, literally brings to life the military events it depicts. The descriptions here bring into being the events that they suggest. As discourse creates the story, in the case of denarration, the discourse abolishes both the setting and transforms the fabula. In other works, both the fabula and sujet are variable. In choose-your-own-story kinds of texts, such as Raymond Queneau's 1961 A Story as You Like It, the reader is offered a series of options to choose from. Both fabula and sujet are multilinear and variable. Although once a particular event is selected, it becomes fixed. This is the combinatory principle around which, of course, many hyperfictions are constructed. Ana Castillo's The Mihiwala Letters operates along similar principles. This book consists of a series of letters sent by one of the characters, but not all are intended to be apprehended by the reader. Instead, the author offers three different reading sequences depending on the reader's sensibility. Thus, the conformist is told to begin with letters 2 and 3 and then go on to number 6, while the cynic is to start with letters 3 and 4 before going on to number 6. The chaotic reader is offered yet another different sequence, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it's important to note that each sequence produces a different story. Thus, we have a partially variable sujet that, once selected, produces different fabulas. On to sujet. In a natural, realistic, or mimetic narrative, the sujet of a work is always linear. In the words of Schlomoth Riemann-Kennan, the disposition of elements in the text is bound to be one-directional and irreversible, because language prescribes a linear figuration of signs and hence a linear progression of information about things. We read letter after letter, word after word, sentence after sentence, chapter after chapter, and so on. For the most part, she is correct. The sujet of a text is simply the sequence of pages you hold in your hands, or the events you experience in performance. But this statement does not apply to many fictions whose reception violates that of natural narratives. Joyce Carol Oates, for example, alters the physical layout of the standard page to create a simultaneity effect by using two parallel columns to disclose the simultaneous thoughts of separate individuals in her story, The Turn of the Screw. The text of J.M. Coetzee's Diary of a Bad Year adds another dimension. For the most part, each page is divided into 3 segments. The uppermost contains non-narrative essays on an assortment of topics. The middle consists of a diary-like narrative that records the narrator's fascination with a young woman. And the final segment of the page contains a narrative of their entire relationship. At several points, the 2 linear narratives approach simultaneity, or at least different perspectives on the same events shortly after they occur. For much of the work, the 2 narratives diverge as one moves ahead of the other in the disclosure of different periods of the same overall fabula. The reader typically starts processing the text left to right and top to bottom, but soon is tempted, usually irresistibly, to continue on with one or sometimes both of the narratives as their events become increasingly dramatic. Mila Radpovich's Landscape Painted with Tea is a novel that is designed to mimic the form of a crossword puzzle. After an opening section, the reader is offered 2 possible sujets, a linear one that corresponds to the across pattern of a crossword puzzle, and another that imitates the down sequence. It leaps across sections of the text as one follows individual plot lines in isolation. The narrator reflects on both kinds of reading as he asks rhetorically, why now introduce a new way of reading a book, instead of one that moves, like life, from beginning to end, from birth to death? He continues, because any new way of reading that goes against the matrix of time, which pulls us toward death, is a futile but honest attempt to resist the inexorability of one's fate, in literature at least, if not in reality. Carol Shields' Happenstance, 2 novels in one about a marriage in transition, has yet another kind of sujet. The book is physically constructed of 2 parts that are superimposed upon one another. Each portion, that is upside down in relation to the other. The reader may start in either direction. The book has 2 covers, 2 beginnings, 2 dedications. One must physically flip the book over to get to what is literally the other side of the story. A more extreme example of a variable sujet is B.S. Johnson's novel in a box, The Unfortunates, which is composed of individually bound chapters that may be read in any sequence, though one chapter is to be read first and another last. Readers are informed that the sections appear in a random order. If they don't like the arrangement, they are invited to place the segments in their own random sequence. That is, it is literally unbound and comes in a box. The ending of a traditional or natural narrative is generally expected to wrap up the plot, reveal all the mysteries, provide some sort of poetic justice, and resolve the major problems that generated the story in the first place. In fact, according to Peter Brooks, Only the end can finally determine meaning. The end writes the beginning and shapes the middle. Many modernist novels, by contrast, refuse to provide any definitive closure to the events out of a conviction that life never comes to convenient conclusions. Unnatural authors often go much further. As already noted, there is the ending that returns, Ouroboros-like, to the beginning of the story, and the ending that depends on which textual sequence was selected by the reader, the Mikiwala letters. More outrageous is the ending that negates itself and presents another equally possible ending, John Fowles, the French lieutenant's woman, being the classic example here. And Michael Joyce explains his theory and practice in the unit called Work in Progress in his hyperfiction, Afternoon a Story. Closure is, as in any fiction, a suspect quality, although here this is made manifest. When the story no longer progresses, or when it cycles, or when you tire of the paths, the experience of reading ends. Then there are the multiple endings that offers several possible contradictory conclusions. Malcolm Bradbury's composition tells the story of a new teaching assistant at a Midwestern university during the Vietnam War. After completing his course on composition, but before turning in the final grades, he is invited to a party with two of his female students. The evening itself is fairly innocent, though some extremely compromising photos are taken. The next morning, the instructor receives a sample Polaroid and a request for a higher grade for another student who has neglected her composition in order to more fully engage in political struggles. He has to decide what to do, knowing that if the pictures get circulated, he is sure to lose his position. The earlier sections of the work are numbered 1 through 4. The final section offers 3 different resolutions, designated 5A, 5B, and 5C. In the first option, the instructor quietly raises the grade and saves his job. In the second, he corrects the grammar of the threatening letter, sends it back to the blackmailers, and defiantly turns in the correct grade. In the third, he agrees with the student that grades are all crap and all language is inadequate. He destroys the grade sheet and abandons all academic work in order to move on and devote himself to life and to love. A temptation many of us have no doubt had. The text offers no indication of which of these possibilities will be or has been actualized. Each option has a certain plausibility. I don't see this as a hermeneutic test in which the reader needs to determine which is the most likely decision, as much of the demonstration of a series of options that the reader is implicitly invited to choose among. As the instructor is informed by one of the other characters, you have to write your own ending. Here we have a fabula that forks into multiple incompatible directions at the end. Narrative. We now need to consider how to theorize multiple versions of the same narrative when they are presented together. Here the primary example will be the German film Lola Rent by Tom Tykwer. The film begins with a dilemma. Lola must obtain 100,000 marks in the next 20 minutes or her boyfriend will be killed by a drug dealer. Lola starts to run. The film then provides 3 different versions of the same basic story, though in each case a slight alteration in a minor event, the dodging of a dog in a stairway, produces a radically different final scenario. I should offer a spoiler alert, but how can one spoil a story that has multiple endings? In the first, Lola can't get the money. She runs to be with her boyfriend who's trying to rob a bank, and she is unintentionally shot dead by the police. In the next version, she robs a bank, gets the money to her boyfriend, but he is then accidentally hit by an ambulance and dies. In the last variation, Lola wins the money at roulette, and she and her boyfriend go off happily into the future. The viewer is challenged to make sense out of this sequence. One possible answer is that, according to the cultural logic, that the latest version is the superior one, we may view the last one as the definitive or real story, the others being, as it were, rough drafts of the final successful version. This would also accord with the logic of comedy, and in fact, it is hard to imagine the versions being sequenced in a different order, and thus imply a kind of teleological progression of the different scenarios. As the narrator of The French Lieutenant's Woman describes the situation, I cannot give both versions at once, yet whichever is second will seem so strong as the tyranny of the last chapter, the final, the real version. But such a move concerning Lola seems a facile way to partially naturalize this radical work, and there is nothing in the film to warrant any such assumptions. I prefer to see it as simply three possible versions of a single set of events, unhierarchized and without ontological primacy being granted to any one version. In a series of paintings of the same object, we don't struggle to establish the primacy of one canvas and the consequent subordination of the others to it. All are equally variations of a scene. Perhaps more pertinently, this film resembles a video game that is played several times. Each playing is equally real. The most fundamental interrogation of traditional story is that of narrative itself. Does a given assemblage of words constitute a narrative? Does it constitute a different kind of text, or does it hover somewhere at the very border of narrativity? A number of recent texts navigate just this boundary. Robbe-Grier's Le Chambre Secrète, The Secret Room, presents several depictions of what superficially appears to be the same scene at different times. Sometimes they appear to be a connected series of actions, scrambled temporally. At others, it seems the text depicts several similar visual images, presumably paintings, which can either form a narrative or else are merely variations on a theme. Both interpretations are right and wrong. Characters are described as moving, which indicates the presence of a narrative, though other images are depicted as painted. The reader is thus invited to construct from the pieces of a text a narrative of a Gothic murder and the escape of the killer. However, because of contradictions in the descriptions of the setting, it remains a quasi-story. The fabula will not stay fixed. It does not endure as a consistent representation of events. In other words, the only way a narrative emerges is if a reader takes up the contradictory events and, adding the narrativity almost forcibly, actively turns them into a story. Something rather different happens to narrativity in David Markson's provocatively titled book, This Is Not a Novel. This unusual text consists primarily of a series of short sentences, most commonly stating the way that writers or other artists or public figures died. Thus we get sentences like, or entries like, Alexander Pope died of dropsy. John Milton died of gout. Thomas Mann died of phlebitis, and so on. There are a few surprises. Antonio Gaudi died after being hit by a streetcar in Barcelona. But on the whole, the causes of death are rarely exotic or unlikely, though there does seem to be a rather high proportion of tuberculosis and surprisingly few from cirrhosis of the liver. The narrator frequently comments on the exact status of his work, among other things stating that this is a novel if writer says so. But is it enough to call something a novel in order for it to be a novel? Unlike, perhaps, Marcel Duchamp's ready-made sculpture Fountain, a narrative seems to require something more. This work, both in its contents and its very title, challenges our notion of narrative. Does it live up or down to its title? Or is it instead a different kind of novel the way Diderot's Ceci n'est pas un conte is actually a story, albeit a somewhat unusual one. By situating itself on the fault line of narrativity, it can serve as an excellent test case for rival theories of narrative. For Gerald Prince, a narrative is the representation of two or more events in a time sequence. The three statements, trifles, Catullus waved away his verses as. Ben Shahn was once an assistant to Diego Rivera. And Raymond Carver died of lung cancer. All appearing on the same page are clearly representations of three events in a time sequence. They are equally clearly, not by themselves, constitute a narrative, any more than any three randomly selected representations of events do. For Jeanette, these would constitute three distinct narratives. Indeed, the entire volume would contain some 2,000 separate narratives. But this formulation gives us no help in determining whether they can form a single narrative. James Phelan affirms that a narrative is somebody telling somebody else on some occasion for some purpose that something happened. This definition won't help us either, since the key question, what constitutes that elusive something, is unexamined. The figure called writer is telling readers several things, but do they form a single extended action? Phelan's definition is better suited to realistic and conversational rather than experimental or unnatural narratives. I suggest instead that the most useful definition will be one that is more diversified, less strict, less tightly bound to conventional practices, and less dependent on a realistic or humanistic paradigm. Our best hope may be with the definition, narrative as a representation of a series of events of a certain magnitude that are causally related, a formulation that ultimately derives from Boris Tomaszewski, and variants of which have been defended by David Bordwell, Noel Carroll, and myself. On the last 5 pages of the text, we encounter these lines. Writer's silent heart attack. Writer's right lung lobectomy and resected ribs. And writer's cancer. It seems that the writer has been and may well be mortally ill. Though no timeline is given, the magnitude of these ailments suggests that death is probably not too far off. This gives the scattered lines a possible frame. The reader is thus perhaps invited to construe the preceding texts as the thoughts or jottings of a man who has been very ill and is approaching death. In such an interpretation, in which the reader again puts the narrative into the text in a much more active manner than one normally produces narrativity, there is a causally related sequence of events of a certain magnitude, as the lines about the deaths and sufferings of artists become events in the consciousness of the narrator who identifies himself as writer. The book thereby becomes a narrative, even a novel, despite its title. It also has, quote, an end and even a note of sadness at the close, to draw from a line early in its beginning. Conclusion. Narrative theory, in order to be comprehensive, needs to be able to account for the distinctive practices of unnatural narratives. To do so, it requires a flexible definition of narrative that will be able to both to include unnatural experiments and also provide a limit that allows us to adjudicate just how a given text challenges or plays with narrativity itself. We also badly need a greatly expanded notion of fabula. Most important is to go beyond the unilinear fabula and to add the concept of a multilinear fabula, a fabula with one or more forkings leading to different possible chains of events. As Jukka Tirkko explains, such narratives offer alternative paths of access to events or episodes, leaving the construction of the plot up to the choices of the reader. Many of the examples adduced in this talk employ multilinearity in one form or another, whether to determine the ending, as in the Bradbury example, the main parameters of the story, Castillo or Tickler, or numerous narrative possibility throughout the text, Keynote and Michael Joyce. We also need an expanded framework to account for other kinds of unnatural stories, including infinite fabulas, dual or multiple storylines with inconsistent chronologies, inherently vague and unknowable fabulas, internally contradictory fabulas, denarrated fabulas, and repeated multiple versions of the same essential story. The notion of sujet also needs to be expanded to include partially and entirely variable sujet patterns. By greatly expanding our concepts of fabula and sujet, we will be able to do justice to the kinds of texts that seek to transform and extend the traditional practices that are, however, readily embraced by those two terms. Finally, we may use these examples to help us better understand the nature of all narratives. All works of literature have mimetic and artificial aspects. Literary realism attempts to hide its artifices. Anti-mimetic texts flaunt them. We will do best to keep in mind the words of André Malraux. L'artiste n'est pas le transcripteur du monde, il en est le rival. The artist is not the transcriber of the world, he is its rival. Thank you.